Okay. Hello. Uh, if you're wondering why the last set suddenly cut off at chapter 14, I'm probably going to edit afterwards after I finish reading the next chapters, but my fire alarm went off. Another false alarm, but it may possibly go off again. But I'm just going to reread chapter 14 since it's literally just only 2 pages here. So I'm sorry, 2 pages, really just one. We're just going to read this chapter 14 and hopefully the fire alarm won't go off again. Okay. Chapter 14. They were mere hours away. Two men connected by history. One her enemy, the other. Alexia didn't know about the other. Not yet, but knew that he meant to reclaim the girl she'd taken from the snow machine. Probably the boy as well. None of them would be leaving, of course. But she was looking forward to the petty intrigues and overblown self important dramas that their humanity would bring to her home. She would enjoy the chance to observe their natural tendencies and instincts before forever altering their lives. She stood in the great hall considering things, possible futures, her next transformation, the structural and psychological changes her new synthesis would create in humans, how she should welcome her new guests. And it occurred to her that her home, deep beneath the ice and snow, might be difficult for them to achieve. She immediately wished for the doors to be opened, for obstacles to be removed, and she heard and saw and felt the result in the same instant, existing in 100 places at once as locks were broken and walls were taken down, as debris was pushed aside and apertures were widened. She was prepared. Things would move quickly now, and what happened in the next hours would, to a degree, define her choices for some time to come. It was all still so new, the templates of her new life written only in sand. Smiling at her own poetic notions, Alexia went to see about the first series of injections for the boy. Chapter 15. Something was very, very wrong in Umbrella's Antarctica facility, but Chris didn't know what it was. On the fifth basement level of the dark and deserted compound, hundreds of feet beneath the snow, Chris stood in front of what appeared to be a full blown mansion made of white brick. There was a fountain behind him, potted plants, even a decorative merry-go-round. He'd been led there, presumably because someone wanted him to go inside, but he didn't know who or why. His instincts were telling him to get the hell out, but he ignored them. He had to, not knowing if he was a lamb being led to the slaughter or if he was being taken to Claire. Since landing the jet in the roof hangar, he'd been guided every step of the way, walking into halls and having doors lock behind him, others opening up in front of him. Twice he'd found jewels on the cold cement floors, pointing him in a particular direction. And once, after taking a wrong turn, all of the lights had gone out. They'd come back on when he groped his way back to where he'd gone wrong. He had been a strange enough It had been strange enough just getting to the facility, passing over the endless miles of gray ice and snow, and then seeing it for the first time, rising up from the blank plains like an illusion. But to be herded someplace like an animal, shuffled along without knowing the reason. Chris was scared, more scared than he wanted to admit. He tried to stop to look around for weapons or clues, but everything had been shut off. Every door he tried locked, except for the ones he was supposed to go through, of course. The cameras that had been watching his every move were so well hidden that he hadn't seen even one of them. But it almost seemed that his shepherd knew his mind, knew what signals to give him, knew how to keep him going. He'd thought initially that it was Wesker, that it was all some setup to trap him, but why bother? He could have strangled Chris at the island if he wanted to. No, he was being guided for some other reason, and it seemed he had no choice but to follow along, not if he wanted to find Claire. He took a deep breath and opened the front door of the mansion, stepping inside. It was beautiful, as extravagant as the front of the building had suggested. Grand staircase, arched pillars, and strangely familiar, though it took him a moment to see how the colors and decorations different. It was the layout, the same basic layout as the front hall of the Spencer mansion. It was surreal, but so perfectly harmonious with all the other weirdness that he didn't bat an eye. Chris stood for a moment, waiting, looking around for another signal, and then he heard what sounded like a laugh coming from behind the stairs. It was the same laugh that he'd heard at the Rockford facility. That woman. What has she said? What has she said? Something about wanting to play? It definitely felt like a game, like he was a character being moved around for someone else's enjoyment, and it was starting to piss him off. That he was afraid only made him angrier. Chris stalked toward the back wall, ready to confront this woman, to demand some answers. But when he stepped around one of the decorative pillars, he saw that there was no one there. What the hell is this? He muttered, turning, and there was Claire, webbed to the back of the stairs as if by some giant spider, her eyes closed, her head hanging limply. Wesker wasn't surprised to find that parts of the Antarctic compound had been built to look like parts of the Spencer estate. The underground extravagance was an incredible waste, but as he noted many times before, so like Umbrella. It was all about intrigue for them, back at the beginning, before it all turned into a bad spy movie. Oswald Spencer and Edward Ashford had been responsible for the creation of the T virus, but it had been their only real accomplishment. The rest was money thrown away. Truly, the entire facility, except for the laboratories, of course, was an expensive joke, set up by old men and children with little imagination and too much money. Aware that Alexia was probably watching, Wesker took his time, moving from level to level, clearing away a few wandering zombies as he walked. He wasn't carrying a weapon, had simply snapped their necks and left them to asphyxiate. Twice he was spotted by other creatures, things he'd sensed and not seen, but they hadn't attacked, perhaps recognizing him as one of their own. Wesker kept moving, sure that Alexia would find him when she was ready. He'd landed his jet some distance from the compound, wanting to be sure that she understood how he was different, that the elements didn't affect him, that he was physically stronger than any 5 men put together, with better endurance and sharper senses. He also wanted her to see that he was respectful of her space, that he was willing to be patient, and that he was extremely determined. Whenever you want, my sweet, he thought, walking through a cold corridor on the fifth basement floor. He'd been through the area already, but knew that the mansion was there, and suspected that she would want to greet him in high style. Didn't matter to him. She could drop him in on a toilet stall for all he cared, but he thought she was probably as vain and spoiled as her brother. However powerful and brilliant she was also a 25-year-old rich girl who had spent 15 of those years sleeping. Rich, beautiful, playful. She probably didn't even understand her powers yet, but it wouldn't be long now. He could feel it. He felt the icy stillness of the cold corridor and started for the mansion once again. Claire woke slowly, her aching body gently supported by warm hands that lifted and held her. She was laid down, the cold floor bringing her around, and when she opened her eyes, she saw her brother smiling at her. Chris! She sat up and embraced him, ignoring her sore muscles, so happy to see him that for a moment she forgot everything else. It was Chris. It was him, finally. Hey, sis, he said, fiercely hugging her back, the familiar sound of his voice making her warm and safe. She wished it could last forever. After so long. Claire, I think we ought to get out of here now, he said, and she could hear a thread of concern behind his words that woke her up, that reminded her of all that had happened. I don't know exactly what's going on, but I don't think it's safe. We have to find Steve, she said, and started to get to her feet, worried. Chris helped her, supporting her while she steadied herself. Who's Steve? A friend, Claire said. We got away from Rockford together, and we were about to get away from here, but something, some kind of creature grabbed our snowmobile and threw it. She looked up at Chris, suddenly more than just worried. Before I blacked out, I heard him say my name. He's alive, Chris. We can't leave him. We won't, Chris said firmly, and Claire felt weak with relief. Chris had come. He knew all about Umbrella. He'd be able to find Steve and take them away. Laughter. A woman was laughing, a high, cruel laugh. Chris stepped out from behind the stairs, Claire following, both of them looking up to the balcony, and there was the woman. It was Alfred? No, not Alfred. And that meant there really isn't Alexia, Claire said softly. God, go goddamn figure. Still laughing, Alexia Ashford turned and walked away, exiting through a door at the top of the stairs. She might know where Steve is, Chris said urgently, even as it occurred to Claire, and then both of them were still. She might know where Steve is, Chris said urgently, even as it occurred to Claire, and then both of them were running, climbing, Claire quickly outpacing him, ready to slap the truth out of Alfred's creepy sister. And crash! Behind her, the stairs falling away, Chris rolling to the floor as a huge tentacle smashed through the balcony, like in the snowcat. And then it was gone, retreating through the hole it had created, leaving a trashed set of side stairs behind. The main staircase was still whole, but Claire was stuck on the second floor on a shattered wood island. She'd have to climb down. Claire! She crawled to her feet, saw Chris down below, wincing at some pain in his leg amid the broken wood and plaster. Are you okay? Claire asked, and Chris nodded. And then there was a scream. She felt her blood run cold. It came from beyond the door that Alexia had gone through. And it was Steve. There was no question in Claire's mind. It was Steve, and he was in pain. Can't leave Chris, but. Chris, it's him, Claire said, looking between her brother and the door, not sure what to do. Go, I'll catch up, Chris called. But go, I'll be fine, just be careful. Terrified, Claire turned and ran, hoping she wasn't too late. Wesker stepped into the grand foyer of the underground mansion and saw it wasn't quite so grand anymore. Something had happened to the staircase. Something had happened to the stairs, part of the upper balcony now smashed to the floor. He heard someone moving around behind a huge, jagged piece of balcony still hanging from the tattered carpet and took a step toward it. And there she was, standing at the top of the stairs in a long, dark dress, silky blonde hair tied back from her pale, beautiful face. Alexia Ashford, Wesker said, surprised to find himself somewhat in awe now that the moment was at hand. She looked human, delicate and helpless, but he knew better. Make your pitch. Sorry, whose voice is this? Make your pitch and make it good. Wesker cleared his throat, stepping forward and taking off his sunglasses. Alexia, my name is Albert Wesker. I represent a group who has long admired your work and have been eagerly awaiting your huh, return. She watched him impassively, head tilted slightly, her back straight and stiff. She looked like a debutante at her first society party. And may I add that it's a personal honor to meet you, Wesker said sincerely. My employers told me all about you. I know your father sired you with the genes of his own great great grandmother, Veronica. That, with her genetic material, the very foundation of the Ashford line, he created you and Alfred to be the culmination of genius. Veronica would surely be proud. I know you created T. Veronica in her honor. Careful, he probably shouldn't mention what had happened to her father. Don't botch this up. And that you are the only being alive with access to the virus. I am the virus, Alexia said coolly, studying him through narrowed eyes. Yes, of course, Wesker said. God, he hated this diplomatic shit. He was terrible at it, but he wanted to impress her, to impress upon her how valuable she was to certain interested parties. So, he continued, thinking how much easier things would have been if he got into her in stasis. I would like to I would like it very much. We would all appreciate it if you would agree to accompany me to a private meeting with my employers to discuss an alliance of sorts. I can assure you that you won't be disappointed. She waited to see if he was finished, and then laughed long and loud. Wesker felt himself flush. It was clear from her tone exactly what she thought of his request. Fine. Nice time is over. Wesker stepped forward and held out his hand. We want a sample of tea Veronica, he said, the gloss disappearing from his voice. And I'm going to have to insist that you give it to me. As she started down the stairs, for just a second, he thought she was going to do it. But then she started to change, and he stopped thinking anything. He could only stare, his awe returning tenfold. A step down, and her dress burned away in searing veins of golden light, the light coming from her body. Another step, and her flesh changed, turned a deep gray, her hair disappearing, gray flesh locks growing from the top of her head and flopping down to frame her face. Her nakedness was transformed with her next step, as rough pebbled armor grew over one leg in her groin, curled up to support a rounded breast to cover her right arm. By the time she reached the bottom of the stairs, she no longer resembled Alexia Ashford. His breath taken away, Wesker reached for her, and with the back of her hand she struck him, and then he was flying, landing in a heap by the front door. Such power. He stood up, understanding that force might be useful, and prepared himself to move, to use his own power. And with a smile, she waved her hand and fire burst up from the marble floor. Lines of it surrounding him beckoned to life by her slender fingers. She lowered her hand and the flames went down, but didn't die, still burning from bare stone. Wesker knew then that it was over. If she chose to spare him, he'd be lucky. Without another word, he turned and walked out, running as soon as the door had closed behind him. The part creature left, and only seconds later, the young man followed, believing that he'd escaped unseen. Alexia watched them run, amused but slightly disappointed. She had expected more. The part creature was no threat, and she decided to spare him. His arrogance had pleased her, if not his pathetic offer. The young man, though, brave and self sacrificing, loyal, compassionate, physically a good specimen, and he loved his sister, who was about to die. It would make for an interesting physiological reaction. Alexia decided that she would create a confrontation for them to interact. She would test a new form for herself and see if his grief made him bolder, or if it was proved to be a liability. She laughed, suddenly imagining a suitable and apt form to take. Except for Alfred, no one had known the simple secret of tea Veronica, that it was based on the chemistry of a queen ant. She would try an insectile configuration. She would try an insectile configuration, experience the strengths and advantages that such a form would propose. Her disappointment was past. The girl and her boy would die, and then she would indulge herself with a young man. Oh, okay. Well, tag fell out, so I guess I just have to read chapter. I'm so near the end. I feel like I should just read the rest of this, honestly, because there's not much left. So, bring my milk tea, and let's read chapter 16. Through the rooms and halls of a mansion, Claire had run, afraid to hear him scream again, afraid not to because she didn't know where to look. Past the plush Past the plushly decorated halls, she found herself in the prison area. Cells on either wall. There are the environment cold and dark once more. Lone virus carrier reached for her from behind the bars, wailing. Steve! Her voice echoed back at her, full of tension and fear, but Steve didn't answer. There was a thick metal door to her right, different than the others, reinforced by bands of steel. She opened it, stepping into a small bare room that opened into a much larger one. Steve! No answer, but the bigger room was long and dimly lit, a kind of huge hall, and she couldn't see what was at the other end. She saw that there was a suspended gate between the small room and the hall, which definitely gave her pause. She looked around and found a piece of broken wood on the floor, then wedged it between the outer door and its frame, not wanting to end up locked inside. She hurried into the giant hall, intimidating, oversized statues of knights lining the heavily shadowed walls, her anxiety growing with every passing second. Where was he? Why had he screamed? She was halfway down the hall when she saw him, slumped in a chair at the far end, some kind of restraining bar across his chest. Oh, God. Claire ran, and as she got closer, she could see that the bar was a huge axe, a halberd, the blade firmly entrenched in the wall next to him. He seemed very small and very young, his eyes closed and his head down, but she could see that he was breathing, and she felt anxious. And she felt less anxious. She reached his side and pulled at the giant axe, but it wouldn't budge. She crouched next to him, touching his arm, and he stirred, opened his eyes. Claire! Steve, thank God you're all right. What happened? How did you get here? Steve pushed at the long axe handle but couldn't move it either. Alexia. It had to be Alexia. She looked just like Alfred. She injected me with something. She said she was going to do what she'd done to her father, but she was going to get it right this time. He shoved at the axe again, straining, but it wasn't moving. In other words, she's whacked. I guess she and Alfred were pretty close after all. Steve trailed off, his cheeks suddenly flushing with color. His hands started to twitch, his body trembling. What is it? Claire asked, afraid. So afraid because his body was hunching over, his fingers clenching to fists, his eyes wild and terrified. Claire. His voice dropped an octave, her name becoming a growl, and then he was writhing in the chair, his clothes ripping, his mouth open. What? His clothes ripping. He opened his mouth and a liquid moan came out, frightened at first, but then angry, furious. No, Claire whispered, started to back away, and Steve grabbed the halberd, wrenching it out of the wall, standing up. His body continued to hunch over, his head dropping down, muscles rippling beneath skin that was turning a gray green. Spikes rose up from his left shoulder, two, three of them, as his hands elongated, as a giant bloodless wound grew across his back, as his eyes turned red and animal. The thing that had been Steve Burnside opened its mouth and screamed, enraged, and Claire turned and sprinted away, sick with loss and fright, running for all she was worth. The monster came after her, swinging the massive axe, the sharp edge whistling through the air. She could feel the wind from the swinging blade and somehow found more speed, her legs pumping, pushing her faster. The monster swung again, hitting something, the sound vast and deafening. Faster, faster, the small room just ahead. The gate was coming down, was about to lock her into the hall with the monster. How? Didn't matter. She had to go faster still, and or she would be dead. And with one final brutal push, Claire dove for the shrinking space between the bottom of the gate and the floor, sliding in on her stomach, the gate crashing closed behind her. The monster roared, began swinging the axe with abandon, sparks flying as it attacked the metal bars. In shock, Claire watched it break through three of them, bending the steel by the very ferocity of its blows, before she realized she could get out. Door. I propped the door open, she thought dazedly, and stood up, took a single step toward her escape, and then something broke through the wall with a crash. Not the monster, a thing that wrapped around her like a constrictor, lifting her, another of the tentacles. The monster continued to hack at the metal. It would break through in seconds, and the tentacle had her tightly in its rubbery grasp. Awakened from her daze, Claire beat at her captor, pried at it, but the matter was impervious. It simply held her, waiting for the monster to breach the gate. It wanted to beat her and cut her. It wanted to rip her apart. So it slammed the weapon into the bars over and over, and finally, there was a hole it could pass through. She was making noises in the grip of the thing that held her, gasping noises that made its blood hot and excited, that made it raise the axe, lusting for the end of her. It brought the axe down hard, remembering what he'd told her, promised her. You can get the next one. I will. And it, he, stopped, the blade almost touching her skull. The tentacle waited, gripped her tighter, and he remembered. Claire. Steve lifted the axe again, strong. He was so strong, and slammed it down into the tentacle, slicing through. In a spray of green fluid, the thick coil snapped and hit him in the chest, throwing him into the wall before retreating. He felt and heard ribs break, felt the boil of his blood cooling, felt his strength going away. The pain came, sharp and dull and everywhere, but he opened his eyes and she was there. She was safe. She was reaching for his hand. Claire Redfield, reaching for his hand with tears in her eyes. The monster was gone. She reached out to hold his hand, and he lifted it to his face, to his beautiful, dying face, laying it across his cheek. You're warm, he whispered. Hang on, she said, pleading, the knot in her throat choking her. Please, my brother came, and he'll take us with him. Please don't die. Steve's eyes were fluttering, as though he were trying very hard to stay awake. I'm glad your brother came, he whispered, his voice fading. And I'm glad I met you. I I love you. On the last word, his head fell forward, his chest falling and not rising again. And then Claire was alone. Steve was gone. I'm actually feeling teary eyed. Okay, yeah, we're so close to the end. Oh, sorry, I'm thinking to myself, the part where the snow cat got launched into the air back to trouble. You didn't realize how so close to the end it was because there's barely anything left. Chapter 17. Chris ran, knowing that their time was short as long as Alexia Ashford was alive, afraid that she might already have gotten to Claire. Claire! He shouted, banging his fist on every door he passed. It didn't matter, his shouting. If Alexia was even half as powerful as he suspected, she already knew where he was and where Claire was. Please, please don't hurt her, he thought, the thought repeating itself as he ran down another hall. Through a door, another hall, and another. He didn't know if anything could stop Alexia, but if he could find Claire and get them to the evac elevator, he meant to try and trigger the self-destruct system before leaving. Alexia was halfway to omnipotence and purely evil. She was an apocalypse waiting to happen, and she had to be stopped. Claire! Through a familiar hallway, another Spencer Estate copy, through a door that opened into some kind of shadowy prison, holding cells lining the walls. He had to find her. If he couldn't leave. He wanted Alexia dead, but he couldn't endanger Claire's life, not for anything, and getting her out took absolute priority. And somebody was crying behind one of the closed doors. Chris stopped running and listened, trying not to breathe, tuning out the relentless banging. Chris stopped running and listened, trying not to breathe, tuning out the relentless banging of a virus carrier locked in another cell, another gasping wail, another gasping wail. Claire, oh, thank God you're alive. He ripped open the door, ready to hurt anything even close to her, and saw her sitting on the floor, sobbing, her arms wrapped around a young man, his naked body bruised and pitiful. He was dead. Oh, shit. It could only be Steve, Claire's friend, and though he was sorry for the boy he'd never met, Chris's heart was breaking for her. She looked so fragile, so alone. Something else to lay at Alexia's doorstep. Chris had no doubt that Steve had died because of that crazy bitch, but as much as he wanted to sit down and comfort Claire, to hold her hand and let her grieve, he knew they had to get out. We have to go now, Claire, he said, as gently as possible, and was relieved when she nodded, carefully laying her friend down, closing his eyes with one trembling hand. She kissed him on the forehead and then stood up. Okay, she said, nodding again. I'm ready. She didn't look back, and in spite of everything, he was proud of her. She was strong, stronger than he would have been if he had been asked to leave someone he cared about. Together, they ran back into the hall, Chris figuring that they had to be close to the southwest corner of the building, where he'd landed the jet and seen the emergency evacuation elevator. The self-destruct system was presumably close enough to the elevator to make a fast escape possible. If they could just get to the elevator. He checked every floor on the way up. There were stairs at the south end of the hall, and Chris ran for them, Claire Claire at his side. He could feel the seconds ticking past as they hurried up the steps, felt like time was closing in on them. That Alexia was finished playing. Through the door at the top of the stairs, running out onto a giant metal grid platform. And Chris laughed out loud when he looked behind them, saw the nondescript doors of the emergency elevator. What? Claire asked. Sorry. What? Claire asked. He motioned at the doors, grinning. They'll take us straight to the jet. Claire nodded, not smiling, but she looked relieved. Good. Let's go. Chris had turned back to look at the wall across from the lift. I've got to check something first, he said, wanting to take a closer look at the corner door. It looked like a security door. You go. I'll be right there. Forget it, Claire said firmly. She walked after him, her eyes red from crying, but her chin set and determined. No way we're splitting up again. Chris leaned down to look at the door's locking mechanism inside, standing back up. They were probably at the self-destruct system already. The lock was complicated and unique, requiring a key he didn't have. Besides which, to the right of the door was a lockdown grenade launcher of some kind, one he didn't recognize. The bar holding it down labeled emergency release only. Just as well. We should get out while we can. We should get out while we still can, he thought. He wasn't happy about it. How much more powerful would Alexia become before another chance like this one? Hey, wait a sec, Claire said, began rummaging through the small pack around her waist. Before he could ask, she was holding up a slender metal key, shaped like a dragonfly. There was no question that it would fit the lock. I found it back at Rockfort, she said, bending over and pressing it into the indentation. It fit perfectly, the lock releasing with a solid metallic clink. You're going to set off the self-destruct, aren't you? Claire said, not really a question. Do you have the code? Chris didn't really answer, thinking that there were an amazing number of coincidences in life, and sometimes they worked to one's advantage. Code Veronica, he said softly, and pulled the door open, ready to take it all down, understanding that it was meant to be. Chapter 18. The boy was dead, but the girl wasn't. And now the young man was trying to destroy Alexia's home. And it wasn't a game or an experiment or something to observe. He had to die in pain and misery. How had he dared? How had he dared to consider such a thing? He should be on his knees in front of her, a worthless supplicant for her to do with as she wished. How dare he? Alexia saw the siblings walking away from their treacherous deed, felt them wishing to leave as the automated sequence began. Lights and sounds, flashing, systems shutting down throughout the terminal. Their perfidy? Sorry, what is this word? This is a completely, I've never seen this word before. PER FID? I just lost it. No, come back. FID. Why? There's a cut here because an announcement went over. I'm going to have to edit all my live streams. Jesus. Okay. What was the word I was looking up? Perfidy. Deliberate breach of faith or trust. Faithlessness, treachery. Okay. Never counted that word before. Okay, hopefully there's not any more announcements over my building's intercom. I'm gonna have to just read back from the chapter before, the paragraph before. Alexia saw the siblings walking away from their treacherous deed, felt them wishing to leave as the automated sequence began, lights and sounds flashing, systems shutting down throughout the terminal. Their perfidy was useless, of course. She would be able to stop the destruct sequence with a minimum of effort, using her control over the organic to sever every connection in the facility. It was the thought behind the act that so infuriated her. He had witnessed the glory of her capabilities. He had seen it and fled in terror. And yet he could fancy himself worthy to take a life such as hers? Alexia gathered herself, drawing all of her power in, becoming complete. She knew that the young man had picked up a weapon that had been sitting next to the keyboard, a revolver that someone had left behind. She didn't object, knowing that the firearm would give him hope, and that for victory to be complete, the victor had to take everything. She would take his hope. She would take his sister's life, and then she would take his. When she was whole, she imagined herself becoming liquid, traveling through the structure of her surroundings as easily as the organic extensions she controlled. And then she was doing so, moving to confront the interlopers. They were startled, as if they'd expected to succeed. She slid out from inside her organic carrier, unfolding herself, turning to look into their dull eyes, their wincing sheep's faces. She watched them watch her, curious in spite of her anger. They argued in front of her, he insisting that he would handle things, that the girl should flee. The girl accepted, but reluctantly, insisting in turn that he should survive. Following that ludicrous statement, the girl turned and ran for the elevator. Alexia moved to intercept, raising her hand to smite the girl, and a perforation opened in her flesh, distracting her. A bullet had entered her body. She turned and smiled at him, the gun in his hand, and reached into herself, pulling the bullet out and tossing it toward him. As gratifying as his expression was, the girl was gone by the time she turned back. It was time to expand her boundaries, Alexia decided, to show him what she was, what she could do, and to put the fear of God into him. Because as she closed her eyes, imagining, wishing, she stopped being Alexia Ashford and became Wraith, divine and merciful. I wasn't expecting to actually finish the cold read of this book here, but we're finishing it. Chapter 19. The self-destruct sequence has been activated, a recording intoned, reverberating through the room, crowding out the rest of its message. You have 4 minutes, 30 seconds to reach minimum safe distance. Combined with the sirens and flashing emergency lights, Chris was on sensory overload before the fight even began. Alexia raised her hand to hit Claire, and Chris fired. The 35, I don't know how to say bullet names. The 357 bucking in his hand, the shot blasting over the self-destruct alarms, definitely explosive. Yes, a clean hit, right through the gut, and Claire was already at the elevator pushing the button, stepping inside. But instead of bleeding, instead of faltering even a step, Alexia smiled at him. She lifted one of her slender gray hands and pushed it into her body, the flesh melding seamlessly, flowing like water. A second later, she held up the round he nailed her with and gently tossed it in his direction. Bad. This is very, very bad, Chris thought numbly. And then she started to change. The little gray female crouched on the metal grid, and her liquid flesh started to crumble, to form tiny peaks and dips all across her body. The tissue bubbling, expanding. The peaks became mountains, the dips valleys, all of its grains swelling as her limbs started to fold in on themselves. Her arms curved over and joined the growing mass, the legs disappearing into it, the texture turning rough and serrated, veins like cables rising, and she kept swelling. Her head rolled down and she became part of the giant round body of her, gray becoming muscle tissue red, the purple and blue of blood vessels networking across like a tide. You have 4 minutes to reach minimum safe distance, someone said, but Chris barely heard her. He was backing away, becoming more and more convinced that this was not going to end well. The elevator was blocked, and she just kept getting bigger. Thick tendrils pushed out from beneath the elephantine mass, undulating like waves, spreading across the platform. Chris's back hit a wall, stopping him, and the massive tumorous thing, suddenly rose up as if unbending from some non existent waste, spreading giant wings, a dragonfly's wings, raising a contorted and deformed half human face. The face opened its mouth and a gigantic roaring shriek spilled out, the wings trembling from the raw power of the sound. And then it spit at him, a thin stream of yellow-green bile that splashed on the platform at his feet and began to eat through the metal. Shit, Chris shouted and barely jumped out of the way as one of the tentacles slashed forward. He had to watch the mouth and tentacles at the same time, and from rounded, quivering pink spheres that had grown up around the base of the giant body, moving things began to crawl out. Chris ran to the farthest corner from the Alexia thing and raised the 357, not sure where to shoot. The small sub-creatures were landing on the platform, some like flat, rounded rocks with tentacles, some like beetles, some like nothing he'd ever seen before. And they were all coming toward him, moving fast. The eyes. If you can't kill it, maybe you can blind it. But the eyes were already blinded, round gray holes with darkness underneath. And he already seen how effective bullets were against her flesh. That decided it for him. Chris took aim and fired, and the pulsating, bloated creature was screaming again, this time in pain, one of her wings fluttering down to the platform. A few of the small organisms had reached him, one of the beetle creatures leaping onto his leg, trying to climb up. Disgusted, he brushed it off, but there was another to take its place, and a third. A tentacle flew at his face, shot from one of the rounded stone shapes. Chris blocked it, but barely. Move. You have 3 minutes, 30 seconds to reach minimum safe distance. Chris ran along the back wall, reaching the other corner in front of the creature and targeted again, trying for another wing. The shot went high, but the next one hit. It howled, the broken wing hanging from shredded connecting tissue, and then spit again, the stream of bile missing his face by inches. The thing now had only its 2 uppermost wings, and though he knew he'd hurt it, it didn't seem to have suffered anything close to serious injury. And I have 2 rounds left. There had to be something he could do, some way to stop it. The self-destruct was going to blow all of them to hell, and it would be his fault. He leaped away as another tentacle whipped out from the creature's base, trying to think. This was a goddamn emergency, and he had to think. Emergency release only. The bloated monster shrieked. More of the beetles were jumping at him, but he ignored them, having only to turn his head to see the inset weapon next to the door, the one with the lockdown bar. A grenade, or rocket launcher, whatever it was beautiful. But the bar was still down. It hadn't released. You have 2 minutes to reach minimum safe distance. Ka-chunk. The bar flipped up. Chris snatched it out, lifting and aiming it at the creature's swollen guts. He didn't know what it would do, but he hoped it was good. He hoped it would shut that bitch down. There was no safety, nothing to chamber. Chris pulled the trigger. Oh, wait. There was no safety, nothing to chamber. Chris pulled the trigger, and a fury of white light and heat leaped from the barrel, blowing into the fat belly like an arrow into a balloon. The effect was huge, the explosion monstrous. A fountain of blood and gray jelly splattered out from the gaping, ragged hole, back splattering onto his face. But he only had eyes for the screaming Alexia beast as its flesh and bone form gave out, deflating. The upper body of the creature was trying to pull free from the dying mass, the two wings flailing frantically at the air, but with only two, it couldn't free itself. And so it was dying. He knew because he could see its blood draining away, because the color of its horrid flesh was changing, turning ashy, the sub creature shriveling because of the absolute complete hatred on its face and the absolute surprise. As the Alexia monster fell silent and began to sag, her features dripping, Chris heard what he had one Chris heard that he had 1 minute left. Claire. He dropped the incendiary launcher. He dropped the incendiary launcher and ran. Oh, whoops. There is a chapter 20. And it's like 2 pages, 3. Actually, just take a drink of water. Chapter 20. Claire felt like shit. And there was nothing she could do about it. Steve was dead, and Chris would either come or he wouldn't. And whatever happened, everything was going to blow up pretty soon, and she had no say in any of it. You have 2 minutes to reach minimum safe distance, the computer politely informed her, and Claire extended her middle finger toward the closest speaker. If there was a hell, if there was a hell, she knew what they played in the elevators instead of music. There was only one jet where the elevator had let her out, and Claire sat on the railing in front of it, her arms tightly crossed, her stare fixed on the elevator doors. She watched and waited, her anxiety building, part of her believing completely that he wasn't coming as alarms blared through the mostly empty hangar, echoing back at her. Don't leave me, Chris, she thought, clutching herself tighter. She thought of Steve, remembering the laugh attack he'd inspired back on the island. Excuse me. She thought of Steve, remembering the laugh attack he'd inspired back on the island. How he'd looked at her like she was crazy. Come now, Chris, she thought, closing her eyes and wishing it as hard as she could. She couldn't lose him too. Her heart wouldn't be able to stand it. There was 1 minute to reach minimum safe distance. When the building started to rumble beneath her feet, she thought she might cry. But there were no tears. She went back to watching the elevator door instead, certain now that he was gone. So sure that when the door opened, when he stepped out, she thought she might be hallucinating. Chris? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, and he was running toward her, splashes of blood and something else smeared across his face and arms. And that was when she understood that he was real. She wouldn't have hallucinated him with goop on his face. Chris, get in, he commanded, and Claire jumped into the second seat, happy and scared and anxious, lonely and relieved, wishing that Steve was with them, and sad that he wasn't. There were more feelings, seeming dozens, but at the moment, she couldn't handle any of them. She pushed them aside and didn't think at all, didn't feel anything but hope. Chris tucked them in tight and started pushing buttons, the small jet roaring to life. Above them, the ceiling slid apart, the storm clouds breaking up overhead as he lifted them out of the hangar, smooth and easy. A few seconds later, they were blasting away, leaving the dying facility behind. Chris's shoulders relaxed and he wiped his hand across his forehead, trying to rub off the sour-smelling gunk. I could use a shower, he said lightly. The tears finally welled up, spilling over her lower lashes. Chris, I thought I lost you too. Don't leave me alone again, okay? She asked, doing what she could to keep the tears out of her voice. Chris hesitated, and she instantly knew why. Knew that it wasn't over for either of them. That was too much to ask. Umbrella, she said, and Chris was nodding. We have to settle this, once and for all, he said tightly. We have to, Claire. Claire didn't know what to say, finally opting not to say anything. When the explosion came a moment later, she didn't look. She closed her eyes instead, leaning back into her seat, and hoped that when she finally slept, she wouldn't dream. Epilogue. Miles away, Wesker heard the explosion and could see the smoke rising shortly afterward. Thick black plums of smoke. Thick black plums of it. He thought about circling the jet back, but decided against it. There was no point. If Alexia wasn't dead, his people would find out soon enough. Hell, the world would find out soon enough. I hope you were in there, Redfield, he said softly, smiling a little. Of course he was. Chris wasn't bright enough or fast enough to have gotten out in time, although he might be lucky enough. Wesker had to concede that much. Redfield had the luck of the devil. It was a shame about Alexia turning him down. She'd been something terrifying and evil, but definitely something. His employers weren't going to be happy when he came back without her, and he couldn't blame them. They'd shelled out plenty for the Rockfort attack, and he'd practically promised them results. They'll live. If they don't like it, they can find themselves a new boy. Trent, on the other hand. Wesker grimaced, not looking forward to their next meeting. He owed the man. After the Spencer fiasco, Trent had, quite literally, pulled his ass out of the fire and arranged for him to be fixed up, better than you. And he'd been responsible for Wesker's introduction to his current employers, men with real aspirations for power and the means to obtain it. And he never admitted, and he'd never admit to it out loud, but Trent scared him. He was so smooth, well-mannered, and soft-spoken, but with a glitter in his eyes that made him always seem to be laughing, like everything was a joke and he was the only one who got it. In Wesker's experience, the ones who laughed were the most dangerous. They didn't feel like they had anything to prove, and they were usually at least slightly insane. I'm just glad we're on the same side, Wesker assured himself, believing it because he wanted to. Because going up against someone like Trent was a bad, bad plan. Well, he could worry about Trent later, after he made the proper apologies to the proper agents. At least the Boy Scout Redfield was dead, and he was still alive and kicking, working for the side that was going to win when all was said and done. Wesker smiled, looking forward to the end. It was going to be spectacular. The sun had come out and was reflecting against the snow, creating a brilliant radiance, blinding in its perfection. The small plane shot away, its shadows chasing it across the sparkling plains. We're done. We have finally finished. Finally finished. It's not like it took a long time, but we have finished Resident Evil Code Veronica. I actually was not planning to finish it, but I saw how much was left. I thought might as well go ahead, especially with the way the latter chapters are so short. The one-page chapter. Yeah, so I'm gonna have to edit the two live streams I did, the two live streams I did for this day, just because I had two interruptions about the fire alarm system. But either way, yeah, I don't know what I have planned for this. I know I wanted to read a Japanese light novel that doesn't have an official English translation. There's a fan translator, but I feel like because they're the only one, for one, I should ask them if I can read it. But two, because it's a Japanese property, kind of makes me a bit iffy, nervous. They When it comes to copyright, there's no concept of fair use there. I mean, in this case, I'm not sure if fair use really works, but yeah. Yeah. Otherwise, I don't know what else to read. I know there is at least one other Dead Space book that is a prequel to the third game, which I have not played. Um, Otherwise, maybe there's other translations, fan translations, or even just official translations of light novels, Korean, Japanese, Chinese, whatever. Um, otherwise, I don't know. I don't know what other books actually have like either novelizations of their games, which honestly I don't prefer, but you know my reasons for reading this. Good to know that I wasn't this time as angry about the snow cat. It made me so furious. I was so frustrated the first time I read that just because like they're getting away, but they're not. They're getting away, but they're not. But yeah, I guess maybe I just wasn't so invested this time. I don't know. But yeah, I'm gonna donate this to the library. But yeah, I don't know what other Dead Space. Mm, I'm not sure if any video games have like original books based off the properties, because that's what I'm more interested in reading. But it's the fact that there's even a Dead Space one it took me by surprise. But either way, that's the end for Resident Evil Code Veronica. Sorry for the well, I mean, hopefully I'm going to edit them out so you may have no idea what I'm talking about. But hopefully I remember to edit them out. Either way, thank you for liking if you liked. Thank you for commenting if you commented. Thank you for subscribing if you subscribed. Thank you for favoriting if you favorited. Thank you for simply clicking on this video. Until next time, if I figure out why I can read or if I get permission to read them, I will be back on Fridays with the cold read series. Until next time, guys, see ya.